DC-6B, construction number 43538, tail number N37559, was built by the Douglas Aircraft Company and delivered to United Airlines in 1952. It was dubbed Mainliner Denver and put into service on their New York to Seattle route. The DC-6B was an ideal airplane for this route because it was pressurized and could fly above the Rocky Mountains with ease, affording its passengers a comfortable ride by flying above bad weather. Unlike today, when commercial air travel has become a drudge to endure, in 1955 it was an event. People wore their best clothes and enjoyed decent food and drinks and, a novel concept today, legroom. United Airlines Flight 629 was a regularly scheduled flight from New York's LaGuardia Airport to Seattle, Washington, with intermediate stops in Chicago, Denver, and Portland, Oregon. There were crew changes at Chicago and Denver. On November 1st, 1955, United Flight 629 arrived in Denver at 6:11 p.m., 11 minutes late due to a ground delay in Chicago. The turnaround was quick, even though the baggage had to be redistributed. One of the baggage handlers in Chicago had lost his keys and believed that they may have been in Cargo Pit 4, which was located in the aft section of the aircraft just behind the galley. The ever-helpful ground crew in Denver unloaded all of the luggage and freight from Cargo Pit 4 and moved it to the other holds so they could search for the keys. Unfortunately, the keys were never found. But the result was that the only items in Cargo Pit 4 when the aircraft departed were loaded in Denver. That would be important later. The oncoming flight crew inspected the plane and found it ready for continued flight. The ground crew topped off the fuel tanks to ensure there was enough to reach the final destination in Seattle, and the Denver passengers boarded the aircraft as their luggage was stowed in the now empty Cargo Pit 4. Engines were started at 6:40 p.m., and the aircraft taxied out to runway 8R, arriving at the run-up pad at 6:44. There were 44 people aboard, including 39 passengers, 3 flight crew, and 2 flight attendants. At the run-up pad, the flight crew completed the pre-takeoff checklist, testing each of the engines to ensure that they were working properly. During the engine run-ups, they received clearance onto the runway and permission to take off immediately. Flight 629 was wheels up at 6:52 p.m., 41 minutes after landing in Denver. This is Crime Noir, Episode 3, Terror in the Sky, the bombing of United Flight 629. If you find this interesting, let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe. With that out of the way, let's get on with our story. On November 1st, 1955, 39 passengers and 5 flight crew boarded a Douglas DC-6B dubbed Mainliner Denver in Denver, Colorado for a flight to Portland, Oregon, and subsequently terminating in Seattle. On board was a typical group of 1950s airline passengers, including a military spouse traveling with her toddler son to join her husband, a few older couples who were visiting relatives, and the usual traveling businessmen. In addition to the flight crew, 3 United employees were aboard flying as passengers. The flight began climbing to its assigned altitude of 21,000 feet, making the required radio calls as they proceeded. At 6:56 p.m., the crew reported that they were passing the Denver omnidirectional beacon. 7 minutes later, controllers in the Stapleton Airport Tower noticed two bright lights in the sky northwest of the airport. One light was brighter than the other, and both seemed to fall at the same rate. When they disappeared below the trees, there was a flash that illuminated the clouds 10,000 feet above the ground. Upon seeing the lights, the Stapleton Tower began contacting all the aircraft in the vicinity to see if they were in distress. All aircraft were accounted for, except United 629. Soon, calls began to come in from farms between Longmont, Colorado, and the airport, reporting flaming debris falling from the sky. Flight 629 had exploded. The first time I heard about Flight 629 was in the movie The FBI Story, starring Jimmy Stewart and Vera Miles. I first saw it on an afternoon movie program that usually showed something from the 40s or 50s. J. Edgar Hoover has a cameo in it, and everyone who worked on the set had to be cleared by the FBI. The movie is a series of vignettes, with Jimmy Stewart's character inserted in place of any agent that Hoover didn't like, most notably Melvin Purvis. The establishing sequence at the beginning is the case of Flight 629. The aircraft exploded at an altitude of just over 18,000 feet, breaking into three main parts: the rear section aft of the wings, the nose section forward of the wings, and the center section, including the wings with the engines still attached. Additional smaller pieces of wreckage, luggage, personal effects, and victims were found scattered in an area of roughly 6 square miles. The wreckage of the center section and wings burst into flames upon impact with the ground. The bad weather, remote location, and intensity of the fire hampered firefighting efforts, and the remnants of Flight 629's fuselage smoldered for 3 days. The National Transportation Safety Board had not yet been created at that time, and investigations of airplane accidents were under the authority of the Civil Aeronautics Board, the CAB. Investigators arrived at the scene the next day, and due to the large area of the crash scene, they adopted a new and novel approach to gathering the evidence. They brought in a survey team to divide the crash scene into a grid pattern made up of 1,000 by 1,000 foot squares. A number identified each square in the grid, and each piece of wreckage or other evidence was photographed as it was found, plotted on a map of the grid, and then removed to a warehouse at Stapleton Airport, where a wire and plywood mock-up of the aircraft had been built. The evidence gathered from the crash site was laid out on a scaled-down version of the grid the surveyors had created. As each piece was examined, it was wired into its proper place on the airplane mock-up. The investigators noticed an unusual smell as they handled some of the shattered parts of the airplane: sulfur. It was a distinctive odor, and it shouldn't have been there. In the immediate aftermath of the crash, CAB investigators realized that a major problem would be identifying the remains of the victims, but they had an advantage that would not have been available to them even 15 years earlier. World War II marked the first time that large numbers of people were fingerprinted for reasons that did not involve criminal activity, and those fingerprints were held on file by the FBI. Upon learning of the crash, the FBI contacted the CAB and offered the services of their fingerprint division. This offer was accepted, and a group of fingerprint experts was dispatched from Washington. The victims of the crash were removed from the scene and taken to a temporary morgue set up in the National Guard Armory in Greeley, Colorado. By the time the FBI arrived, 9 of the victims had been identified by family, friends, or by personal effects. Of those that remained, 21 were identified through their fingerprints. 5 were printed due to service in the military during the war, 6 due to employment in the defense industries, 2 were government employees, and 1 had voluntarily submitted fingerprints to the FBI for purposes of personal identification, which I didn't know was a thing you could do. 2 passengers had emigrated from Canada and were printed when they applied for naturalization. United Airlines provided the fingerprints of the flight crew and 1 flight attendant who was flying as a passenger. The 2 men and 12 women who were not identified through fingerprints were eventually identified by relatives. Back in the warehouse at Stapleton, the reassembly of the aircraft was proceeding. It revealed that the DC-6 had broken first just behind the wings, and the cabin floor above cargo pit 4 was driven upwards. The lower fuselage had been blown out, as had the forward and aft bulkheads. The skin was shattered into fragments, large and small. Many of the parts exhibited the odor of sulfur. They also found bits of copper wire that were not part of any of the airplane's systems, and a curious fragment of sheet metal that had the letters HO printed on it. It was clear the damage was the result of an explosion, and there was not supposed to be anything in cargo pit 4 that could have caused such an explosion. The CAB notified the FBI that they suspected sabotage brought the plane down. While the CAB continued its technical investigation, the FBI began looking at who may have had a motive to bring down an airliner full of passengers. In November of 1955, United Airlines was dealing with a labor dispute involving a local airline union in Denver that had escalated to a strike and complaints of some aircrew crossing the picket lines to keep United flying. While not as severe as it had been in the early part of the 20th century, labor violence was still a thing in 1955, and many people did not think it too big a stretch to imagine that labor radicals might put a bomb on an airplane. That the downing of the airplane was the work of a radical union member was quickly dismissed. The random thought that it was a possibility was all investigators had. There was no evidence. The FBI began looking at the passengers, trying to determine if any of them may have had a reason to bring a bomb on board, or if anyone held a grudge against one of them that led to the bombing. What often gets lost in stories involving plane crashes is most of the effort is put into talking about the airplane and the technical details of the investigation, but the victims, if mentioned at all, are just an afterthought. Before we move on, I'm going to introduce those who lost their lives in this tragic disaster. What follows is based on the article in the November 28, 1955 issue of Life magazine, which is available in Google Books. The photos are those that were presented at trial. Starting with the Seattle-based flight crew that boarded the airplane in Denver. Pilot Lee Hall had been with United Airlines for 15 years. He was married to a former flight attendant. Donald White was the co-pilot. He had been flying since he was 16. Donald joined United in 1951. The flight engineer was Samuel Arthur. Arthur was married and had 2 children. Flight engineer was not his normal position, as he was a fully qualified captain, but due to the strike, he was filling in on this trip. The senior stewardess was Jacqueline Hines. She was 26 years old and, as all stewardesses were required to be in those days, was unmarried. Jacqueline had been with United for 4.5 years. The second stewardess was Peggy Ann Petticord. She joined United immediately after college and had been with the company for 10 months. Barbara Cruz, a stewardess for United, was flying as a passenger. She was based in Denver and was heading to Seattle to spend some time with her family. Sally Ann Schofield was also a United stewardess who was traveling as a passenger. She was engaged to a United Airlines pilot and was going to visit with Barbara Cruz in Seattle to make plans for her wedding. Faye Ambrose was a United Airlines sales agent visiting Denver to check out a job the airline had offered him. The Association of General Contractors had held a conference in Denver, and Frank Brennan, Elton Hickok, James Purvis, and Clarence Todd had attended. They were either officers of the association or worked as general contractors and were members. James and Sarah Dorey were traveling from Whitman, Massachusetts to visit a married son in Portland. Stuart Morgan was a consulting engineer who had emigrated from Canada to Chicago along with his wife, Anne. She was accompanying him on a business trip to their former home in Vancouver, British Columbia. Gurney and Elizabeth Edwards were flying from Providence, Rhode Island to Seattle to visit Mrs. Edwards' sister before traveling to Honolulu, Hawaii to see their son, who was on duty with the Navy. Mr. Edwards was an attorney and a trustee of Brown University. Virgil Herman owned a used oil reclaiming business in Vancouver, Washington. He and his wife Goldie were returning home from visiting Mrs. Herman's sister in St. Louis. Helen Fitzpatrick and her son, 18-month-old James Fitzpatrick Jr., were heading to Okinawa to join her husband, an Army officer who had left for Okinawa the day after James Jr. was born. Bror and Irene Beckstrom were returning from New Mexico, where they saw their son Howard, who was with the Army. Bror owned electric contracting companies in Seattle and Fairbanks, Alaska. Jack Bromlin was the superintendent of the County Humane Society in Seattle. He had attended a national convention in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Louise Bunch was the widow of a Forest Grove, Oregon pastor. She was returning home from a church convention in Colorado. Thomas Crouch was a carpenter's apprentice heading to Seattle to start his first job with a Washington construction company. Carl Deist was a sales manager from Burlingame, California, and James Stroud was an assistant general sales manager. They worked for Oldsmobile and traveled together to meet with dealerships in the western part of the country. Jack Desjardins of Overland Park, Kansas, was the general manager of a chain of department store beauty shops. He was on an inspection trip. Brad and Carol Bynum were returning to their home in Sherwood, Oregon, from seeing his parents in Amarillo, Texas. Carol was pregnant with their first child. Brad was a geologist for Sinclair Oil. Layla McLean, at 81, was the oldest passenger. She was returning to her home in Portland after seeing her stepson in Glastonbury, Connecticut. Airman Second Class Jesse Sizemore was returning from leave in Jennifer, Alabama, to his duty station at Elmendorf Air Force Base in Alaska. Marion Hopgood was an electrical engineer from Philadelphia. He was on his way to Portland to inspect an equipment installation for his company. J.W. Jungles was a heating engineer from Aurora, Illinois. He was going to Portland to inspect an HVAC system that his company had installed. Gerald and Patricia Lipke were going to Portland to visit Mrs. Lipke's sister. They left 3 sons at home. Ralph Van Valen was a retired dentist from Newberg, Oregon. He and his wife Minnie had gone to Unionville, Pennsylvania to visit family. Minnie was a genealogist, and the couple had taken a side trip to Washington, D.C. to check records at the National Archives. Alma Windsor, a housewife from Newfoundland, was flying to visit her sister in Tacoma, Washington, whose husband had contracted polio. Harold Sandstead was a deputy director of the U.S. Public Health Service, and he was flying from Washington to Portland to give a speech at Oregon State College. Flight 629 was delayed a few minutes in Denver so that Dr. Sandstead could make his connection. Daisie King owned a drive-in restaurant in Denver, and she was going to visit her daughter who lived in Alaska. The sulfur odor and a powdery gray residue on many of the pieces of the recovered contents of Cargo Pit 4 indicated to CAB investigators that the damage to the airplane was the result of the detonation of an explosive device. The FBI sent a sampling of the contaminated parts to their lab, where technicians determined that the residue was the result of a dynamite explosion. The wire and the mysterious metal fragment were also sent to the FBI lab. The wire was determined to be the type used with blasting caps. The metal fragment turned out to be part of the casing for an ever-ready 6-volt hotshot battery. Another indication of an explosion was the condition of the mail stowed in Cargo Pit 4. Some letters were somewhat singed around the edges, but much of the mail was shredded into confetti. What was an accident investigation became a criminal investigation. Now, the FBI has a formula for solving crimes, and it is not what we see on most TV police procedurals. The formula is the same tried and true methodology that has served police work since the first professional police departments were founded. Get around and talk to people who may know something about the crime. In this case, that is what the FBI initially did. Agents across the country contacted the family, friends, and acquaintances of everyone on the flight, searching for someone who might have a motive to bring the plane down. This quickly became the largest investigation in FBI history to that point, But in this case, the investigation went a little differently than it usually did. Instead of zeroing in on a suspect based on information gathered from their legwork, it was the forensic evidence that led investigators to a perpetrator. From very early in the investigation, the CAB knew that whatever caused Flight 629 to fall from the sky happened in Cargo Pit 4. They also knew that everything in Cargo Pit 4 had been put aboard in Denver. It was unlikely that the cause was in the mail. It could have been in the cargo or the luggage. When the FBI began its criminal investigation, it focused on the luggage first, and something curious showed up. All of the luggage recovered from Cargo Pit 4 was intact, but one bag was missing. While reassembling the airplane in the hangar, bits of the missing bag, including its luggage tag, were found. The bag belonged to Mrs. Daisie King. Daisie King was born Daisy Eldora Walker in Buena Vista, Colorado in 1902. As a child, she was a tomboy who grew to enjoy hunting and fishing, hobbies that she continued to pursue throughout her life. Her father was an attorney and somewhat prominent Colorado politician, having served as a district attorney, state legislator, and county judge. In 1921, Daisy married a man named Tom Gallagher, and the couple had a daughter who they named Helen Ruth. The marriage was rocky, and adding a child did not improve the situation. The couple divorced in 1923. 6 years later, in 1929, Daisy married William Graham, a mining engineer. The couple spent the next several years moving from town to town following William's various mining projects. On January 23, 1932, Daisy gave birth to her second child, a son that the couple named John Gilbert Graham, his middle name being in tribute to his grandfather. He would be called by his nickname, Jack. By this time, the United States and much of the world were in the depths of the Great Depression, and none of William Graham's mining ventures seemed to pan out. William died of pneumonia, leaving Daisy and the two children destitute. Daisy took a job with the telephone company, and her mother was able to watch the children. This worked out okay for a few years, but Daisy's mother passed away in 1938. It appears that Daisy came into a small sum of money upon her mother's death. She placed her daughter into a Catholic boarding school in Canyon City, Colorado, called St. Scholastica. Young Jack Gilbert was placed in the Clayton School for Boys, a charitable trust endowed to house and educate young boys whose fathers had died and whose mothers couldn't care for them. 2 years after sending her children away, Daisy married again, this time to a wealthy rancher named Earl King. She retrieved Helen from the boarding school, but for some unknown reason, Jack remained at Clayton. This marked a turn in Jack's behavior. When he first arrived at the Clayton School, Jack Graham was described as a mischievous boy who was well-behaved and hard-working for the most part. After his mother's marriage, he became sullen and often acted out. He expressed to the staff that he believed his mother did not love him because she put him in an institution. For Christmas 1942, Daisy told Jack that he would be coming to King's Ranch for the holidays. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, Jack's teachers reported that they had never seen him so excited. That Christmas, his mother and new stepfather surprised him with a special gift, a pony. He believed that he was going to stay at the ranch. I cannot imagine the emotional devastation he felt when he was told that the pony would remain at the ranch, but he would be returning to the orphanage. Upon his return to the Clayton School, Jack, who had been somewhat troublesome, became a major discipline problem. A behavioral report written in early 1943 indicated that Jack could not understand why he couldn't be with his mother full time, as she lavished attention on him during visits and vacations. His depression, which had subsided in the lead up to Christmas, returned with a vengeance, and his bad behavior escalated. He took to sneaking out of the school at night and burglarizing homes. That came to a head when the mother of one of his classmates found him in her house one night stealing money. The result was that the school determined that Jack's proper place was with his now remarried mother and discharged him. At first, things seemed to go well with Jack. He was enrolled at Tapanas Elementary School, where he was an above-average student. But as he entered his teen years, things began to go awry. He entered Sterling High School in nearby Sterling, Colorado, but only completed his freshman year, dropping out to work on his stepfather's ranch. Jack had some kind of conflict with Earl King that quickly escalated to the point that during an argument, Jack pulled a revolver and began muttering about how he wasn't being treated right and he was going to do something about it. Daisie, in a panic, called the sheriff, who arrived in time to persuade Jack to put down the gun. Jack left the ranch and set out for Alaska, planning to live with his sister. He only made it as far as Seattle, taking a job as a longshoreman. He then enlisted in the Coast Guard, even though at 16 he was underage. Daisie assisted him in the deception by providing a letter saying he was 18. It seems that life in the Coast Guard was not very agreeable to Jack. He was not in for very long before he went AWOL, returning after 43 days. He was hospitalized in a psychiatric ward for reasons that are not clear, but may have involved severe alcohol abuse. In their reports for Jack's medical records, the doctors found that he didn't suffer from any mental illness, and his main problem was immaturity. This finding was reinforced by Jack's own statement to one of the examining physicians, which was included in the record. I just took a notion that I'd get out of the service by going AWOL. I was fed up with saying yes, sir, and no, sir, and getting punished for things that didn't seem important. I had $200 and went to New York, Chicago, Georgia, and Washington, D.C. I was hitchhiking, and I had a lot of fun drinking, dancing, and going to parties. I didn't feel sorry about it, but I'm not happy about it. It's just one of those things. But I don't want a bad conduct discharge. If I stay in the Coast Guard and don't get a leave, I'll go over the hill again to see my mother. In the course of all this, the Coast Guard discovered that he was underage, which solved everybody's problem. Jack was discharged and sent home to his mother. When Jack first returned to Denver, he lived on his stepfather's ranch until May, when he moved to live with his sister in Alaska. While there, he worked with the Army Corps of Engineers, doing construction at what later became Elmendorf Air Force Base. After about 6 months, Jack returned to Colorado, settling in Englewood, where he lived with his uncle, Vern Walker. He then worked several jobs, eventually landing as a bookkeeper and payroll clerk for the Tempte Brothers Automobile Company. This gave him access to blank company checks. Jack decided to take advantage of the situation and graduated from burglary to check forging. He wrote out checks to himself totaling over $4,300 and left town. He bought a car and took a major road trip around the country, including visits to Salt Lake City, Seattle, Kansas City, and St. Louis. He did have an entrepreneurial side, though. On September 11, 1951, a Lubbock, Texas police officer attempted to pull Jack over for a traffic violation. Jack refused to stop, and a high-speed chase ensued, reaching speeds in excess of 100 miles per hour. The chase only ended when Jack's car was fired upon after crashing through a police roadblock. The car was loaded with whiskey that Jack was transporting to one of Texas' dry counties, and Jack was also armed with a pistol. Strange as it may seem, Jack got lucky in a way. Texas had a fleeing felon law at the time, meaning that a criminal fleeing the scene of a crime could be shot by police to end the pursuit. The officers fired at his car, and he wisely stopped. Jack was arrested and charged with transporting alcohol illegally, for which he got 60 days in the county jail. He was then extradited to Colorado to face the check forgery charges. Once Jack arrived in Denver, it was Daisie to the rescue. She hired a lawyer for him and assisted with restitution by making an initial payment of $2,500. Since her father was a prominent local politician and her husband was a wealthy rancher, Daisie knew people. Routt County Sheriff William McFarland testified on Jack's behalf, stating he was a reasonable risk for probation. It carried weight, despite the probation report's statement that Jack did not seem to be very concerned about his offense. Jack characterized it as one last fling before he was drafted to go to Korea. Jack's draft number never came up, by the way. The judge suspended his sentence and put Jack on probation with a requirement that he make restitution. Jack seemed to have an epiphany. He didn't have any more scrapes with the law and maintained employment and made his restitution payments on time. What caused this turnaround? While his experience in a Texas county jail must have been a factor, I think the main reason was the same thing that straightens out so many troubled young men. He met a girl. I've only been able to find a couple of pictures of Gloria Elson. The grainy newspaper photos don't do her justice. She appears to be a bit taller than average, maybe 5'8" or 5'9", and wore her hair cut short in a curly updo that was so popular in the early 50s. She had a pleasant smile and wore light-colored cat's eye glasses, which were very fashionable at the time, but when she removed them, she looked much younger. Jack could not get married without his probation officer's permission, and when he asked for it, it was denied. His PO thought he should wait until he was more financially secure. What happened next was an indicator that Jack had turned himself around. Jack worked hard and saved his money. On June 14, 1953, after 9 months, he got permission to get married. The young couple settled in Grand Junction, Colorado, where Jack found work for a construction company under contract to the Atomic Energy Commission. They soon had a son who they named Alan. While all of this was going on, Earl King had sold most of his ranch, and he and Daisie had moved to the town of Yampa. Earl died of heart disease in October of 1954 and left Daisie with a considerable inheritance, but it was in the form of a life estate. This meant that Daisie could not choose who would receive the estate upon her death. It would go to those chosen by Earl in his will. Half would go to Earl's brother-in-law, and the other half would be divided between Jack and his sister. The bequest would not go through probate and could not be challenged. Between Earl's estate and the money Daisie received when her father died, Daisie's net worth was about $150,000, equal to nearly $1.8 million today. With her new affluence, Daisie offered to buy Jack and his family a house in Denver if Jack agreed to move there from Grand Junction, and the house had enough room for Daisie whenever she was in town. They found a home on the northwest side of town that had what today would be called a mother-in-law suite in the basement. To give her son a little pride of ownership, Daisie provided the down payment for the young couple and helped them obtain a mortgage rather than pay for the house outright. Once Jack and his family were set up in the house, Daisie returned to her second home in Florida, where she spent most of her time following the death of her husband. Just 2 months later, Gloria Graham went into labor. She had had a tough pregnancy, and there were complications, so she delivered her baby, a girl that they named Suzanne, by cesarean section. Upon hearing the news, Daisie immediately flew back to Denver from Florida to care for her grandchildren while Gloria recovered. At this time, Daisie also chose to start a business with Jack. Despite neither of them having any experience in the restaurant business, Daisie financed a drive-in and made Jack the manager. Drive-in restaurants were very popular in the 1950s. While they could operate year-round in places like California and Florida, in Colorado they were seasonal businesses. If the weather cooperated, they could be open from maybe early April to mid-October. Daisie must have understood the importance of location. The favorite cruising street for Denver teenagers was Federal Boulevard, and she located the drive-in right in the heart of it. Daisie named the restaurant the Crown A Drive-In. Initially, the Crown A did well, but there were problems. Daisie complained to an acquaintance that Jack seemed to be taking money out of the business as fast as it came in. She would know because she established the business as part of a life estate and maintained financial control. On September 2nd, 1955, a driver passing the Crown A witnessed an explosion that blew out the windows of the building. The explosion blew the fire out, and the damage was superficial. Investigators determined that the cause was arson. The back door to the kitchen had been forced open, the gas lines servicing the roaster had been unscrewed, and the tap turned on. Jack told the investigator that he didn't know who might want to burn the business down and offered that it could have been a burglar who was disappointed that there was no cash in the building. Jack subsequently filed an insurance claim for the damage, and although the building was quickly repaired, he did not reopen for the remainder of the season. While Denver police begrudgingly agreed with Jack's opinion that the explosion was the work of a disgruntled burglar, several other people weren't so sure, and some of them went to the investigators with their own opinions on the matter. but it all came to nothing, and the insurance company paid to repair the damage. The Denver police and the arson investigators seemed to be unaware that Jack had a previous insurance claim under suspicious circumstances. Only 2 months earlier, his brand new pickup truck had mysteriously stalled on the tracks at a railroad crossing and was struck by an oncoming train. FBI investigators initially didn't know anything about Jack Graham, and it was only when they searched Daisie's personal effects that they thought her son might be a person of interest. Several passengers had been ejected from the aircraft as it broke up during its fall, and they were scattered across the beet fields where most of the wreckage had landed. One of those was Daisie King. Her purse landed near her and was now in a cordoned-off section of the warehouse where the airplane was being mocked up. Looking through its contents, the FBI found a newspaper clipping about Jack's check forging scheme that listed Jack Graham as one of Denver's 6 most wanted men. The agents decided that they should have a talk with young Mr. Graham. Their first contact with Jack was when they met with him and his sister, Helen Hablutzel, ostensibly to get some background information on his mother. They played this off as checking on the backgrounds of the passengers to determine if there was anyone who may have a grudge or financial interest in any of their deaths. That wasn't far from the truth. They were doing that, but they also wanted to take a good look at Jack. The agents were impressed with Helen, who offered a very frank assessment of her mother. She described her as a difficult woman who never seemed to find happiness and sometimes held grudges and could be moody. One thing they found unusual was that both Jack and his sister referred to Daisie by her given name. Neither called her mom or mother. The agents asked Jack about his relationship with Daisie as it pertained to the Crown A drive-in. He explained that while the property deed was in his name, the business itself was in Daisie's and placed in a life estate. He claimed that she exercised complete control of the financial aspects and that he could only write checks for small expenses. When asked about the explosion that had happened earlier, Jack denied any involvement and then added a story that someone had shot the windows out of the building earlier that spring. Then, without prompting, he revealed the second insurance claim for his pickup truck that had stalled on the railroad tracks, even complaining that he thought the truck was a total loss, but the insurance adjuster disagreed and had the truck repaired. The agent shifted topics to Daisie's preparations for her trip. Jack revealed that he had asked Daisie to delay her trip and stay in Denver through Thanksgiving, but Daisie wanted to get to Alaska in time for caribou season. The agents followed up with a common question in a murder investigation: if there was anyone who might have a motive to harm his mother. Jack responded that Daisie suspected that the former manager of a second drive-in restaurant she owned in Steamboat Springs had been embezzling from her. He also mentioned that there was some animosity between Daisie and her brother-in-law, who was also the beneficiary of her deceased husband's life estate. The conversation again shifted to Daisie's activities leading up to her trip and the day she left. The agents asked for a description of Daisie's luggage. Jack described the 3 bags she had and how the large Samsonite bag had a broken hinge. Daisie secured the case by winding some clothesline around it. When asked if he had helped Daisie pack, Jack insisted that Daisie was adamant about packing for herself and refused any assistance. The following day, the FBI sent 2 agents to Graham's home to meet with his wife, Gloria. She corroborated Jack's story regarding Daisie's packing habits, but added that she had seen Jack with a box wrapped as a Christmas gift. Jack had spoken of buying his mother an X-Acto toolkit to use in her hobby of making costume jewelry from seashells. Gloria assumed Jack had bought the kit and wrapped it. On November 11th, the FBI received a call from Jack's father-in-law, who said that the agent should speak to his wife. When interviewed, Gloria's mother, Christine Elson, told of a phone call with Gloria in which she described how Jack seemed to be cracking up, unable to sleep, constantly pacing, and also how he claimed to have had a premonition of his mother's death while eating at the airport after seeing her off. He claimed the thought made him ill, and he excused himself to go to the bathroom to throw up. With this information, and the information found in Daisie's purse, the FBI decided they should re-interview Jack. The next day, Jack and Gloria came to the local federal building known as the Customs House, believing they were there to identify some of Daisie's belongings. The agents had gotten the fragments of Daisie's suitcase and some strands of clothesline that had been found among the luggage and arranged them on a table. There was also a small framed photo of Earl King. After confirming that the items were from Daisie's luggage, the couple turned to leave. The agent, Jack Wagner, asked if Jack would be willing to remain and answer a few more questions. The agents thoughtfully offered to give him a ride home so Gloria could leave and get back to the children. Jack was taken to an interview room where the first questions regarded the ammunition that investigators had been told Daisie had packed in her luggage. Jack estimated that it was several hundred rounds. They then asked about the X-Acto tool set that Jack supposedly bought for his mother. He stated that he had shown the advertisement to Daisie, and she replied that the $30 set was not suitable for her hobby, and the one that she needed cost $150. That was too rich for Jack's blood, and he told the agents he had not bought the set. Their questions then turned to the day Daisie left for her trip, and they had Jack recount everything that happened. After a session of questioning, the agents took Jack to dinner at a nearby hotel restaurant. Upon their return to the office, the demeanor of the question shifted. Wagner asked Jack if he had ever used dynamite. Jack should have known at this point that they were looking at him as a suspect. While the Miranda decision was 10 years in the future, the FBI had informed Jack of his rights before questioning, and if he had a brain, he would have shut up and lawyered up. But he kept talking. Agent Roy Moore, one of the first agents to question Jack, was a man who got to the point. He had just received the FBI lab report on the residue found on the wreckage and items found in Cargo Pit 4. The residue was sodium carbonate, sodium nitrate, and other sulfur-bearing compounds. It was the residue of a dynamite explosion. Moore crossed his arms in front of him and leaned forward with his elbows on the table. He looked Jack straight in the eyes and said, "I accuse you of blowing up the plane. Did you do it?" Jack answered the question as confidently as it was asked. "I did not." Moore then asked if Jack would allow a search of his home, cars, and business, to which Jack agreed. It was now nearly 8 p.m., and while Wagner and Moore continued to question Jack, a half-dozen FBI agents appeared at Graham's home. Presenting the document Jack had signed to Gloria, the agents scoured the house. As they were searching, the phone rang. It was Agent Moore back at headquarters. Jack Graham had admitted that he had bought the X-Acto toolkit and hidden it in his mother's luggage, and Gloria knew about it. He claimed that he had bought the kit for $10 from a man who hung around at the Hertz garage where Jack worked a second job. He said he had lied about the kit because he was afraid it might have been stolen. Both he and Gloria signed affidavits stating that he had not purchased the X-Acto kit. The agents informed Gloria that she had committed a federal crime by lying on the form. The searchers found several boxes of rifle and shotgun ammunition in Daisie's room, and these were taken back to headquarters and brought into the office where Jack was being interrogated. When confronted, Jack replied that he must have been mistaken about how much ammo his mother had taken with her. Other items found by the search team were then brought in. Among those items was a flight insurance policy in the amount of $37,500, listing Jack as the beneficiary. The policy bore Daisie King's signature. Jack denied all knowledge of it. They found 2 strands of yellow wire in the pocket of one of Jack's shirts. It appeared to be, and forensic examination later proved, that it was the same type of wire that had been found in Cargo Pit 4. In continued questioning, the FBI picked apart Jack's story. A few minutes later, Agent John McCulloch came into the interview room and told Jack that he had interviewed all the other mechanics who worked at the Hertz garage, and none of them had ever seen the man that Jack claimed sold him the X-Acto kit. That was the end of the line for Roy Moore, who said, "You have been lying to us all night, Jack. We are going to charge you with the crime. Why not make it easy for us?" At that, Jack took a long drink from the glass of water on the table and replied, "Okay. Where do you want me to start?" At 1 minute after midnight, November 12, 1955, John Gilbert Graham confessed to the bombing of United Airlines Flight 629. And that's where we're going to leave it for now. In part 2, we will go back to the day of the bombing and the events leading up to it. Then we will try to crawl into Jack's head and figure out what led him to this act. This has been Crime Noir, Episode 3, Part 1, Terror in the Sky, the bombing of United Flight 629. Stay tuned for Part 2, and don't forget to like and subscribe.